Thank you all for being on time. I'll share my screen so that we can get started. Hello, everyone, wherever the world you're joining us from. Thank you for registering and joining the discussion. So on today's agenda, I'll begin with introductions, and then I'll hand it over to our speakers to give an overview on the topic. Triston will tackle the essence of a strategic career plan, while Barbara will expound on the MBA itself. I'll then pose several questions to our speakers to steer the discussion forward. And then finally, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So before I go on, let me encourage you all to put any questions that come up in the chat, and then we'll get to as many, if not all of them. And finally, we'll open it up. Finally, we'll share some resources and ways to stay in contact with the speakers after this session. So let's start. So my name is Ruth Kinyua. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm the lead at Integral Steers Advisory. My focus is on improving business outcomes for SMEs who not only pursue commercial returns, but also generate substantial net benefits to the society or environment. So prior to setting up a boutique advisory, I spent 7 years living, studying, and working across 3 countries, Switzerland, the UK, and the US, and these experiences inform my mindset in life and my approach in business. So for today, I am joined by 2 titans of their industry. They have graciously agreed to speak about strategic career planning and the value of an MBA. First is Triston Francis, who joins us from Singapore. Triston started his professional career with brief stints at Goldman Sachs and Google. He then joined Morgan Stanley full-time for 6 years, working within the investment banking, sales and trading, and the multicultural client strategy team. Triston also served as a design manager for the Asia Pacific Leadership Institute at the Boston Consulting Group, BCG. Currently, Triston works within C's Group COO office, where he focuses on people and organizational strategy. Triston received his MBA from Harvard Business School, where he served as a student body co-president for his class and graduated with second-year academic honors. At HBS, he co-developed a course called Crafting Your Life. The course is based upon his interviews with up to 120 HBS alumni on how they crafted their personal and professional lives after HBS. So far, more than 100 HBS students have taken this course. Triston also holds a Bachelor of Science with concentrations in finance, legal studies, and business ethics from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. He was one of 4 students on campus recognized by the university president for having positively impacted Penn's campus through leadership. Triston, it's an honor to hear from you today.
Hey, thank you, Ruth, and looking forward to the conversation.
Then we have Barbara Coward. Barbara is an internationally acclaimed admissions consultant with proven expertise in strategic and influential content development and storytelling. With over 20 years of admissions experience, she is also the founder of MBA 360 Admissions, which has clients on all continents, except Antarctica. Her clients have been accepted at the most competitive business schools in the world, such as Harvard Business School, Wharton, and Chicago Booth. As a former MBA admissions director, Barbara brings an insider perspective of the entire admissions process to support clients with resumes, essays, and business school selection. Barbara is also a business school influencer and contributes to prominent media on MBA admissions, including Bloomberg, Businessweek, Fortune, and US News and World Report. Barbara received her MBA from the University of Bath in England. She completed a BA in French from Vassar College in New York. Thank you very much to both our panelists. It's an honor to be here as a moderator and a privilege for everyone on the call to hear directly from you. Right, so Triston, will you kick us off with a brief overview on the topic?
Really excited for the topic today and want this to be an open and candid conversation. So to the extent that people have questions, please do feel free to submit the questions in the chat, and we'll be sure to try and address as many of those as possible. Maybe I'll kick it off just by thinking about or speaking a little bit about the why, at least for me, and I think that Barbara will certainly have some perspectives here as well. And getting an MBA is a very individual choice. But I would say that for me, the big factors, one was I felt like the MBA would be a really good opportunity for me to introspect and be very clear in terms of what I wanted to do with my career and life. It's just a very good environment to have that space to be able to process, think, talk with classmates, talk with professors, and so forth. So I think that introspection was part of what I was seeking. The second thing, from a very tactical perspective, I was in investment banking at the time. And although I was happy to be at Morgan Stanley, I knew that long term I didn't see myself staying there. And the MBA was a very natural way for me to transition, ultimately transitioning into management consulting, feeling as though it would bring me in the right direction as to what I wanted to do. So that's maybe just a little bit of like high level to kick it off in terms of the why for me. But again, I think that because it's such a personalized decision, it's less about when you're speaking to people who have MBAs, it's less about why they decided to get an MBA. And it's more about thinking through what is it that you're trying to ultimately accomplish with this, what's ultimately a very big investment, not only in terms of the money spent on the MBA, but also the time off of work, foregoing salary and so forth. So I'll maybe pause there and turn it back over to you, Barbara and Ruth.
Thank you, Triston. Thank you for deconstructing your journey for us, which is certainly useful as we think about it. Barbara, what about you? What is the MBA? Could you give us an overview?
Sure. I'm somebody who speaks off the cuff as I think about things. So I kind of mentally had thought about this question and was going to have an answer. But given what Triston just provided, I wanted to just provide a counterpoint to that, if I may, just to show, because Triston's kind of perspective of the MBA was from a very professional perspective. Mine was personal. I had actually, and I think this is just helpful to spend a couple of minutes quickly going over this. I was working in Boston in financial services. I was in my mid-20s. I had just been promoted to division controller for a mutual fund company. My boss had gone to Harvard Business School, but for the executive program, which is called something different now than it was way back when. But anyway, he was a big proponent of Harvard Business School. And I was a French, as you mentioned, Ruth, I was a French major. So I really didn't know a whole lot about accounting. And he advised me to get an MBA and do it part-time in the evenings. The company paid for it. And he said, you might want to start with an accounting class. And so that's what I did. And I was about a third of the way through when I met my then husband, who was from England, and he couldn't move because he was third generation family business manufacturing, but I could. But I was through my, third way through my MBA, and many of my friends have been doing full-time programs. And I think, like a lot of things in life, when your friends are doing something, you're like, I want what they have. And because they were doing full-time programs, and one was at Yale at the time, and another one, her husband was at Duke, and actually deciding between Duke and Chicago. And she went to Duke because she wanted the warmer weather in North Carolina compared to Chicago. And so I thought that was kind of my solution, is to move over there and do my MBA full time. And so I redid a lot of the classes. My credits wouldn't transfer. And then I was asked by the dean when I graduated to set up the first admissions office. So I traveled the world recruiting students. And this is going back to the late 1990s. And then in one shape or another, I've been in this industry ever since. So going directly to your question of what is an MBA, I've spoken to a lot of people around the world at different stages of their careers. And to me, it's almost, if you look at it from the Financial Times rankings and the rankings perspective, there's a clear, financial benefit. What was your salary before the MBA? What was your salary afterwards? The Financial Times even has an index of aims achieved. What percentage of your students had their aims achieved, which I think is a kind of fairer one. Because nobody ever comes to me when I'm working with them to say, what program is going to help me make the most money? I've never had that question. It's always, this is what I want to do. I want to make greater impact in the world. This is what I'm thinking of doing. And so for me, it's an opportunity to reset and a launching pad to say, hey, this is what I'm doing now. I might like it. Some things I might not like. Maybe there's something going on in my personal life. I had somebody who went to Wharton who told me that the kind of trigger or catalyst for her was her dog died. And she was like, yeah, I think I need to do something for myself. And so I don't want to kind of diminish that in terms of saying personal experiences and what happens to you in your life can really form that. And I have another person I'm working with now who, uncle who really championed him and mentored him had passed away. And he's like, I want to do it for him. And so now he's thinking on his way to apply to an MBA. So I just really think it's a great degree to give you options in life and to help pivot you from a little bit of what Triston was saying, from one thing to say, hey, I think I want to do something else. And so I just encourage people to think about it as from the broadest sense of the world, rather than just, oh, an MBA, I want to go work on Wall Street, or I want to do investment banking, or I want to, make a lot of money, which obviously is nice. But it just really it's a degree to kind of help with your satisfaction, personal and professional, and the happiness quotient as well.
Okay, thank you. I think one must take into account both the pragmatic as well as the idealistic considerations of the MBA as you think about it. And as you said, a host of reasons impels young professionals to make the decision to pursue an MBA. And Triston has actually touched on a bit about that as to why he did, going back to the genesis of his MBA journey. And so I think one other question I have for Triston as we move on is that, what was that main priority when you finally decided to go to HBS?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about goal setting and priorities in the context of MBAs, and then also in the context of thinking about how all of this fits into the career and life you're looking to build, is I think that, an MBA program, even though it's 2 years, it goes by very quickly. I think most MBAs that you talk to would say that. And as a result of that, I think the more that you can be clear on what the priorities are for you and why those are your priorities stepping into the program, the more I think you'll actually get out of the program. So in my case, there were a few very big priorities that I had. One, building off the one that I mentioned, I knew that I wanted to pivot from financial services into management consulting. And I actually before entering the MBA program, I knew that of the management consulting firms, BCG was my top choice. And so I was very focused in terms of course, applying to multiple firms, but I was very focused in terms of trying to, leverage the MBA and career services to get my foot in the door and successfully end up at the Boston Consulting Group. So that was one goal. A second goal of mine was to try and meet as many of my classmates as possible. So I actually knew going into the MBA program that I was planning on running for student body president. And the reason for doing that is I knew that I'm somebody that is introverted, contrary to what a lot of people would think, because I host a lot of webinars and I take on a lot of leadership positions, but those are actually deliberate choices for me to do because I know that relative to most of my peers, I'm a little bit less comfortable when it comes to, say, a large happy hour and just walking up to people and shaking hands and so forth. So for me, taking on a leadership position was actually a good way of, once you end up in this seat, my peers will come to me, given the natural nature of the seat and the partnerships and the collaborations that you do and what your role is in the context of the broader class. So it was a way almost of forcing myself outside of the comfort zone to achieve that broader goal of meeting as many of my classmates as possible. And the third piece is I went in knowing that, so very long term, I'm not there yet, but another 15, 20, 25 years, I'd actually like to return to HBS as a professor. And knowing that, I decided to run for, so HBS, the class size is 930, and they break that up into 10 groups of sections, as we call them, of 93 students. And every single one of those sections has one person that is the education rep. And it's basically a liaison between your section of 93 students and the professors that you have, because you all take the same courses. So you all have the same professors for the first year. And so through this role, that was my way of basically being able to see the classroom through the eyes of the professor, because you work very closely with them, both giving the professor feedback from your peers, but then also receiving feedback from your professor and passing that along to your peers, not in an individual perspective. So it's not like you're not going to a particular student and saying, look, you need to do this differently, but you're saying things that are true across the whole cohort. As an example, my section had a really difficult time, according to our professors, as it related to constructive debate, which is kind of what the case method is built off of. So the professors would come to me and they'd say, look, I understand that you're here and you want to make friends and everything like that, but you need to develop the skill of being able to disagree in a way that removes the emotion from it. And it led to a lot of broader conversations. So I'd say that those were kind of my three primary goals that I had in mind. The other thing is I wanted to use this as an opportunity to get a lot of international experience. So I told myself I would take advantage of every opportunity to travel. And over the span of the 2 years, if I'm including the summer before in that equation, I traveled to about 20 different countries, most of which with classmates who were from that particular country. So it was a really good opportunity for me to be able to do that. I knew that I wanted to work abroad. I didn't think that I would be doing it immediately after business school, but when the opportunity for me to do so came up, I kind of jumped on it. Very glad I moved on it at the time that I did. So I'd say international experience was kind of a fourth goal of mine, but it wasn't quite as concrete as those first three goals, which were BCG, class president, being the education rep. And a lot of times, I think that if I were to reflect back on this experience, I think a big part of the reason why the MBA and the 2-year experience ended up unfolding the way that I had kind of hoped that it would was because I had spent a lot of time before actually going into the MBA, getting very clear on what are the goals that I have, what are the activities, how do I plan to spend my time. So I think the more you invest, one of the questions in there, Ruth, was around, is there anything that you can do to prepare for the MBA before you've actually started the 2-year program or the 1-year program, depending on where you go? And I think a big way to actually prepare for that is to think about what are the goals and how will you choose to spend your time once you're actually in the MBA program. So that's kind of how I thought about prioritization, goal setting, and the MBA experience.
Okay, so let me just reiterate what I've heard and combine what both of you have said, because if we go back to the title of this webinar, it's about, how does an MBA fit into a strategic career plan, right? And so the primary focus of a strategic career plan is competitiveness. Ideally, such a plan should respond to changes and future opportunities in a way that gives the person, a competitive advantage and differentiates them from their peers. And I think that's very important what you've said as to the reasons why you pursued, both you and Barbara, is that one, it was a moment to pause in life and be introspective about the way forward. It was also a moment to pivot, so to pivot into a different industry or to go into a different function. And then I think the last thing that I also heard is that it's also an opportunity to reinvent yourself, right? So during the MBA, you go in, you have that time to think through and gain clarity over your life, and then decide what you want to be when you get to the other side. I think the analogy of a caterpillar fits right here perfectly. You lose yourself in the cocoon of the academic program, and then you emerge on the other side as something different. Yeah. And so, yeah, Triston, you also mentioned about preparation, and I think that is something that came across clearly through all the pre-submitted questions, and it's something I think that as a young professional, I'm also wondering as I think about the MBA. And I strongly believe in the 5P sentiment that, proper preparation prevents poor performance. And so with this, I want to turn it to Barbara. Can one prepare for the MBA?
Absolutely. It's never too early. And I would just say, if if I reverse engineer in terms of what the schools are looking for, and I don't want to lump them all together because every school has its own culture and its own mission, but starting with HBS, to develop leaders who make a difference in the world, or for Stanford GSB, create an impact, change lives, change communities, change the world. Yale SOM, I have them all not all, but memorized, for business and society. And so I would kind of like think about those missions and think about what you can do if you're kind of thinking about doing an MBA that would align with that, what, and for better, for worse, situations happen in society that provide opportunities to do that. So I'm thinking, namely with COVID, I saw so many articles, both of people within the MBA world, without it, outside of it, who were, in fact, I worked with somebody who's at Tuck right now. He's a second year student now, and he was, from San Francisco, and he was helping create, vaccine kind of, what do you want to call, places to get vaccines. And sorry, it's like super early for me, so I'm like thinking of the words. But anyway, so he helped with COVID in that way. And then I remember also seeing partners. A lot of these business schools, if you are with somebody, they're very inclusive, and just can speak to this in terms of getting your partners or families involved too. So there's a lot of activities, and there are some women at Tuck, partners who were sewing masks for people during COVID. So I would just say, look in terms of things that you're really passionate about. And the big no-no is not to just say, oh, I want to apply to, one of these great schools, and I think I better like work for Habitat for Humanity, or one of the, things, just to have my resume look like I'm doing volunteer work. I mean, they'll see right through that. I did one article, if you Google my name, and then it's about like, what volunteer experience should you have on your resume. So think about what you're passionate about, and then, kind of take an extracurricular activity, do something outside of work. Maybe it's within work, create some kind of initiative to solve a problem that people are having. And the other thing I would do too is just be, and I'm a voracious reader, and so I'm always reading everything, but I read a lot of business school news. In fact, I kind of joke that I'm not reading as many novels as I'd love to, because I'm consuming so much content to stay on top of the industry. But like, read the Financial Times, pick up The Economist, any of those things, and just see what's going. Right now, the huge, at least from the state's perspective, is I keep hearing about inflation. During COVID, it was the supply chain crisis. Just kind of get familiar with those kind of major news stories that impact business and society. And I think that's a great way to start preparing for it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to try stack the odds in your favor, irrespective of whichever program that you want. And, all those activities that you mentioned, they add lifelong career value. They're assets that will keep giving back, irrespective of if you eventually do go and do your MBA or you do not. I think just having that momentum in terms of something motivating you to go out and add value to society, to start something, do great things, that's great. Or is it career assets overall? And so I think investing in preparing for the MBA as early as possible is going to make the all-round process of applying and actually going to MBA school much smoother, because Triston also said he was very intentional when he went. He wanted to develop his leadership skills. He wanted to gain very specific things. And so once you have that awareness, once you have gone through that introspective process, maybe 1 year or 6 months before that, then by the time you get there, you're ready to hit the ground running, right? And that said, it certainly isn't a one size fits all for everyone. I think, as you said, our lives are busy, professional demands are always there. Maybe familial pressures, so many things are happening at once. And so one should manage expectations accordingly. So going back to Triston, I think one of the things that I was curious about is the skill sets that one gains from the MBA. And so what for you was the set of skills that have defined your career post-MBA?
Yeah, so I think that when I think about skills, I think it is less about the hard skills, and I think it is more about the soft skills. Now, that is a little bit dependent on the background of the individual before they start the MBA program. And I make that caveat because, I talk to some of my HBS classmates, I'll use, 5% of our MBA class comes from a military background as an example. The people who are coming from a military background, they had a lot of benefit in terms of the finance, the accounting, the very structured, required curriculum that HBS puts you through. And so for them, they might actually say, no, a lot of these hard skills were very helpful. Building financial models, that was really helpful for them. In my context, because I had studied finance at Wharton for undergrad and because I had worked in investment banking, I didn't really feel as though I was walking away with hard skills, and that was okay. I knew that was going to be the case prior to starting the MBA program. The best way in my mind to learn how to build a financial model is to actually do it while at an investment bank, as opposed to learn about it in a classroom, in terms of the hands-on experience of it. And so I caveat that with saying, but in my case, what I learned, there was a tremendous amount of value from a soft skills perspective. And people at HBS, professors at HBS will oftentimes say they're not actually preparing you for that first job out of business school. They're actually preparing you for 20 years down the line. They're preparing you to be on the board of directors. They're preparing you to be the CEO of an organization. They're preparing you for those longer term jobs. And basically in the short term, they're kind of navigating under the assumption that, look, you made your way to HBS, you'll figure out how to navigate these early stages of your career. They'll provide some support, but it's not really at HBS so much about the technical training. I think every school probably has a little bit of a little bit of spectrum and philosophy there. I think HBS is probably among the furthest along that spectrum in terms of we're preparing you to be a CEO of longer term outlook type of mentality. Back to the question in terms of skills that I learned from a soft skills perspective, I definitely learned things around, how do you actually think about and create space for decision making in different scenarios? How do you navigate? The other thing I learned is really, how do you navigate large institutions? HBS itself is a large institution. It's $1 billion business. So just seeing the inner workings of an organization that actually, of all organizations that I've been at, including, Morgan Stanley and BCG and so forth, I think the way that HBS itself as a business operates is really fantastic and seamless. The way that the executive, the executive education, the way that they build corporate, everything that they do, the ecosystem. So I learned a lot, I guess, just by being in that ecosystem. And then I would say bigger than the skills that I learned was really, if I'm being honest, it's really the relationships that I built. So the relationships with the professors who I'm still in touch with to this day, that opened up opportunities. As an example, my biggest advocate internally, one of my two biggest advocates internally when I was working as a consultant at BCG, was one person who used to lead the people and organization practice area for the company globally. But I got to know him through an introduction from one of my professors. And the professors, they have such rich and deep and historical and strong relationships with these individuals, because oftentimes they were the teachers of these individuals who then went on to become CEOs of organizations or step into these large leadership positions and so forth. And I think a lot of these people will never forget their favorite teachers. I know that are professors. I know that I certainly won't. So I think that there's a lot that you get from that relationship perspective, and that alumni network perspective. I remember I had went on a trek, actually. I went on one of my section mates was from Kenya, and I went on a trek to Nairobi. He took about 20 or 30 of our classmates to Nairobi with him. And we basically, it was a little bit of just enjoying the holiday, but also trying to understand a bit about doing business in East Africa and so forth. And then At the tail end of that trip, a subset of that group was supposed to go to Egypt. That trip got canceled at the last minute because at the time there was a terrorist bombing of a tourist bus. And a lot of people just felt like it wasn't the right time to go to Egypt. And so, I decided at the last minute I was going to go on a trip to Uganda on my own. So I went to Kampala and I reached out. I looked at the alumni directory. I reached out. There was like four alumni in the directory who were from Uganda, three of which were still there. I reached out to all of them, basically reaching out on the Friday before showing up on Monday. All three of them responded within 24 hours, including one person who's an alum that's like 20 years out, and he's CEO of one of the largest companies there. Met with me for more than 90 minutes when I showed up there the following week, and was just really mapping out to me, look, if you want to do business in East Africa, this is what you need to keep in mind. This is what you need to be aware of as a foreigner, really just laying things out. So I think that there's I provide that example because that's a very concrete one of somebody who's 20, 25 years senior to me. He's CEO of a very large institution, doesn't know anything about me, yet I send him a cold message and he's willing to meet with me, carve out 90 minutes, and just unparalleled access. But that's kind of something that you get once you're an alumni of one of these programs. Certainly I feel that way at HBS. When I reach out to people, it's like you can kind of skip the process of you trying to prove yourself to them to a certain extent, and you can dive right into the pitch. And people typically approach these conversations with a, where are you? How can I help? mentality. So as long as you're clear on what you're trying to get done and you're looking for from these conversations and relationships, I think that it is a major accelerant in terms of setting up some of these things through relationships. And so I would say that's probably the biggest thing that I got from it, beyond, I guess the skills component. But that relationships component will continue to pay dividends for a lifetime, without a doubt.
Okay, yeah. So if I can incisively capture what you've said, is that the social capital for you was extremely important, the social capital that you gained. And that beyond that, that you also gain the career capital in terms of soft skills, which have a high transferable value in terms of whatever that you choose to pursue in future. I mean, if you're thinking about skills such as leadership, negotiation, these ones, they apply to a wide range of possible career plans. And so they have that compounding dynamic in that whatever you choose to do in the future, it will give you an edge, having had that rigorous assessment and rigorous experience where they were really tested and refined. And I think beyond the hard skills that you also mentioned that some militants try to get during the MBA, is that those soft skills, the strong work ethic, the standards and the rigor, they really move the needle in terms of lifelong career options. And so knowing those values that you want to get and the non-negotiables that will really push your career forward as you go into it is a great way to plan for it, and is a great thing to take out of the MBA once you're actually in it. And so with that, I think I want to remind our audience, please put your questions in the chat function so that we can get to as many, if not all of them. Just a reminder about that. And so as we move on, I think, Barbara, I'm curious about the transformation that occurs during the MBA program. So as I mentioned, I think there's a growth spot, or you come out of the MBA as sort of a different person, or reinvented, reimagined sort of new person. And so I'm curious, I mean, with all the inordinate amount of opportunities that the MBA program provides, Triston just mentioned a few, from the international experience to the class experience. I mean, from working with MBAs, what for you is typically the inflection point, and what, when, or who normally spars this mindset shift?
So that is a terrific question. And, primarily I work with people in the journey to business school. And so, I keep in touch with some, but some I just, they go on. And so I don't know the answer specifically, like how they changed in the transformation during that process. But I would say that that process even starts during the admissions journey, because the essays that you're writing are very introspective. I'm working with somebody right now, and we went through a lot of different iterations of it, and just, because of that reflection process. So for Harvard Business School, which, is pretty, some schools change their essays from year to year. HBS is one that seems to keep it year after year, but what else would you like the admissions committee to know about you? That's a pretty open-ended question. And prior to this year, when Triston went, there was no word limit. Now they have a 900-word limit because they wanted to give some I guess some guidance in terms of how long it should be. That was a common question, like how long should I make it? And so I think it is that part of discovering yourself. I mean, Stanford GSB, one of their essay questions, which is a signature question, is, what matters most to you and why? You can't help but be a changed person in some ways of going into this. And I have people who will, ask their friends and family, like, what do you think matters most to me? Or, and so I think you gain clarity about what you want to do. That happened a lot during COVID, where people were like, hey, anything can happen. So why am I doing this job where I'm just doing it for like the hours, and why don't I do something that really I'm passionate about? And maybe like Triston, who has, which I didn't know, which is really exciting, has aspirations to become a professor at HBS. Maybe it's not something I do in the short term, but it's something in the long term. So definitely, I think it's just that learning about yourself. And then when you're in the program, meeting people from so many different backgrounds. I mean, that's the goal of the admissions committees, is to have a really diverse cohort. So, to Triston's point, when you suddenly find yourself going to Uganda, you can like look up a directory and find 3 alums and reach out to them. And they want to make sure there's that breadth of people from all around the world and different backgrounds and perspectives in the classroom. So that's it. But I just want to go back a little bit, and it kind of relates to your question in a way, but to pick up on something that Triston said, I've been, in terms of career stages, I'm kind of like, I'm down the runway a little bit more from you guys in terms of having seen it all. And I would say the thing that I've seen in terms of family and friends that trips people up the most in their careers isn't the hard skills, isn't the, capital asset pricing model, which I learned 20 years ago that I can't remember unless I look it up right now, or net present value and all those things. It's the soft skills and the people skills. And I do think that there is, to some extent, a myth in a way that you go to one of these elite schools and your life is like perfect, and it happens. And that does happen quite often, in terms of like the CEOs that were mentioned. But I have a friend of mine, she and her husband were both HBS alums who have graduated decades ago. And one of them found himself laid off from his job and spent a lot of months looking for a new one. And she, is also somebody who has, been in situations where she has looked for other jobs too. And I think it's that having that insurance policy and that safety net, if you will, of that network. And that's something that I kind of smile at, because a lot of the schools in their marketing, because I used to do marketing for schools, will say, we have 25,000 alumni. And I'm like, well, that's great. I don't think I'll like reach out to all 25,000, maybe like 3 or 10. But I think it's more of the stories, like the Uganda story, which I loved, that kind of illustrate the benefit of the alumni network. Is what are you going to do when you are working and maybe you're in a senior leadership role for the company, and all of a sudden the company has hit a brick wall, and its sustainability is at stake, and you need to find something else. What are you going to do if you have a great relationship with your manager? Maybe it's the CEO, and the CEO retires and somebody else comes in and they want to kind of change the whole ethos and culture of the institution. So again, it's twofold. It's one, it's the soft skills to learn with how to work with difficult personalities, because again, that there's always going to be those people in the workplace no matter what you do. And so it's the skills to do that. And then also that that kind of lifeline, or life boat, or whatever you want to call it, that when things happen down the road, you have a family and a network to go back to saying, hey, how would you handle this? Or what else is out there? Do you know of opportunities for me? So, and I just think all of that, just again, going back directly to your question, is that at any stage during the MBA program, you'll talk to somebody, you'll meet somebody, and it'll just make you think of possibilities you just never knew were even on the table before. And I think that's very, very empowering.
I like that answer, leaving room for ambiguity and serendipity, which can happen with any person, in any course, in any club that you choose to join. And so just being open, having that open mind that this experience can heavily impact you in multiple ways and in ways that you cannot fathom yet. So in the interest of time, let's start looking at some of the pre-submitted questions that came in, as well as some of the questions in the chat. So I think one of the recurring themes that occurred in the questions was the question of funding. So I think one of them was, given the young demographic of individuals who end up in MBA programs, and one has, familial obligations and other things that they need to consider, how should they start thinking about funding and scholarships, etc.? And I think, Triston, would you be able to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so I would say that in terms of funding, sadly I did not get any financial aid when I went to HBS. So every dollar that's listed on the tuition website, I paid, and well worth all of those dollars. I oftentimes tell people that even if the program cost a cumulative $1 million, I would still do it. Of course, I would need a very generous loan program that had some good repayment terms and a runway to pay that off. But broader point being, I think that there's a tremendous amount of value that far exceeds what is, candidly speaking, a very high price tag. And, for me, I would say, and actually when people ask me what are some of the things that I didn't like about my HBS experience, or that I didn't like about the way that HBS was run, most of the stuff that I would have to say was, 98% positive. I would say one of the areas that I always had a little bit of a gripe with was the way that financial aid is managed, which I know is a very challenging situation, but I think the reality is, as an example, in my case, I'm a first generation college student. And although yes, I did graduate and I went and I worked in investment banking. While I was working in investment banking, I was helping pay for my brother financially. I was doing other things. So from an actual financial perspective, I was much less well off than, say, somebody who graduated and was the child of somebody that was very wealthy. But maybe that permitted them to go into a nonprofit sector, and therefore, because the way that HBS looked at financial aid, they basically just looked at like, what is the cumulative amount of income that you've made over the past 3 years? And if that number exceeds, when I went there, it was if that number exceeds 120,000 on average per year, inclusive of bonus, then you're just you're not going to be eligible for financial aid. And I didn't think that was the right way of cutting it, because I had, classmates of mine who I could look up online and see that, in one instance, I could look up online and see that their family had hundreds of millions of dollars and they were on financial aid. And in my case, I was like, I'm over here, helping my brother out financially, who's living below the poverty line in New York, and I'm not on financial aid. So I was like, whatever it is, in my mind, I was like, the system is very clearly broken. Now, that's a very complex problem to try and solve. So I don't blame HBS for it, right? Because just because that individual comes from a family that's very wealthy doesn't necessarily automatically mean that that person is going to have their family pay for their MBA, even if in 99% of the cases that ends up being the case. And so you kind of have to think about it. I know that the school is trying to do some things to modify the way that financial aid is done. I've heard from some rumors from the grapevine, but I actually don't know the specifics of it. But I did hear that HBS was launching a program to try and address this. And I was happy about that because it's one of the things when I was in student government and had that podium and platform to be able to speak to, administrators and the people who are making this decision on behalf of the institution. It was one of two topics that I was constantly in every single meeting, including with the dean, was like, look, this is broken. Something needs to be done differently. Mental health and the way that psychology is treated. Or access to a therapist, was treated was the second category. And so these were kind of two things. So I guess what I would say there is I don't have a lot of perspectives in terms of paying for the MBA, in terms of getting financial aid, and the fact that I didn't get any financial aid. But I would say that there are financial aid opportunities that are out there. I'll maybe turn that one over to Barbara, because I think this is actually a universe where Barbara would have much more perspective on me as somebody who lives and breathes this single year through clients, which I'm sure this is a top of mind question that a lot of people have.
Yes, Barbara, what are the funding options available?
Gosh, so I really appreciated hearing Triston said, and I did not know about HBS, and I, just for the record, I agree with you. That does not seem fair that somebody who is supporting somebody and would not. So I'm glad. And I have seen, and I was on a webinar with the head of admissions for our consulting group this past summer, and they were introducing, and I've certainly seen a lot of news about the new initiatives to help people with financial aid. So they're definitely, and one of the great things is, like you said, it's a big business, but also has a big endowment. And so, that helps with scholarship packages, to which point I would say some schools have deeper pockets than other schools just because of their size of their endowment, or their fundraising. A big job for business school deans is going out on the road and pressing the flesh and getting donations. I just saw something from Booth, I think it was Booth recently, about a huge amount that was donated. So there are options out there to pay for it. And I'm going to say something a little bit, it's really interesting, because when I work with people, the financial aid comes up. I've helped people with, some of their scholarships, but not as much as the primary concern is getting in. I think the stakes for some of these schools, it's just so hard to get into them. 10% is it 10% at HBS? I know Stanford, which is the hardest school to get into, is 6%. And so my philosophy, which probably doesn't sound that fiscally responsible, but to be honest, is to focus on, and I hope I'm not being biased because it's just what I do, but on getting in. And then when you get in, then solve the problem, how I'm going to pay for it, which I know is not a small problem. It's a big problem if you have, family and you're supporting people and all that. But, the scholarships, there's a lot out there. Schools have, I know Poets and Quants, which is a big business school media website, has a section on different scholarships out there. The schools have, pages with different ones. I worked with somebody this summer who is at and I want to be careful that I don't kind of give away who I'm working with and all that, but is at a top executive MBA program. And he found a scholarship that was related to his particular background. And so I helped him with the just reviewing his essay for that. So they will make it work. I will say that Harvard and Stanford are needs-based, and some of the other ones are merit-based. But first and foremost, if you want to do it, again, I would almost say focus on what you can do to get in. And then when you get in, then that's a nice problem to have. I would hate for people to, going back to Triston's point, hey, if it was $1 million, I'd have to take out a lot of loans, but I would do it. I think the experience is it's so worth it. I worked with somebody again when I was on the marketing side, who's, and I'll borrow her words, say, how much does it cost? And she's like, well, how much does it cost if you don't do the MBA? And that's hard to know, because you can't anticipate missed opportunities. You can't predict what those are. But I will say that there are a lot of scholarships out there through the loan process. There's companies out there that help students. I think even at HBS, there was one created where they kind of leveraged all the MBA students to kind of get a better rate from a certain bank and to do it that way. So please don't let that be, I always say, the cost and the GMAT. Like, don't let those be the insurmountable barriers that prevent you from moving forward with the journey. Those can be overcome.
Absolutely. If you have the will, you can find a way. And so I'll take one of the questions from the chat. We have one from David Kimondiu. He asks, when is the best time to apply for an MBA, i.e. from the time you finish bachelor's or your undergraduate degree? Barbara, could you weigh in on this?
Yeah, so again, it's really funny because my answer always evolves depending on what I read or what I come across recently. And so my first answer was, a lot of the schools, it's an experience-based program. They want people to bring in their experiences so they can, if you're in the HBS classroom, and there's a case study that's being dissected and discussed and debated, it's really helpful to somebody say, hey, wait a minute, I actually come from that background and that's not the way it works, or whatever. And so if you don't have any work experience, you cannot draw upon that experience in the classroom discussion. But having said that, I just came across Stanford, which I read yesterday, announced their new incoming cohort for this year. And they said, we welcome students straight from undergrad to some people who have 20 years of work experience. And that's a lot of questions I get too, of people who are like, am I too old to apply to? I had that once for HBS, am I too old to apply to HBS? So, I would say the timing is, and again, I go back to the catalyst. I worked with somebody from emerging country who applied to MIT, who only had 2 years of work experience, but he also started his own company. And so we made the argument that he actually had 4 years of work experience, 2 years in the corporate world. In fact, he worked in consulting. And I think actually maybe for the same company you were at, Triston, and then also had launching his own business. And so, I would say do it when you have, and the reason why I brought him up as an example is I think there can be an argument made saying that there are a lot of problems in the world. There are a lot of things that need addressed. So somebody with fewer years of work experience could say, I am so passionate about addressing this inequality or this particular issue in society that, like, why wait 5 years? It'd be better if I got started now to get a head start on that. So, go back to when you feel like you're ready. If you're somebody who maybe only has a few years of work experience, but feel like you could keep up with people who have 6 or 7 years of work experience, then don't let that hold you back. Or if you're somebody who is like, hey, I think I missed the boat, well, not necessarily on that case. Think about, again, the catalyst. What is the right time? I saw the question come up quite a bit in the questions before the webinar, and I get that question a lot, like, when should I do it? My own advice is not to try to, and this sounds kind of weird, but game the system, because a lot of people say, should I wait this year? Should I wait next year? It's so unpredictable right now in the US. And I know many of our participants are overseas, but there's a shortage of domestic students. And so, it's a great time to apply as a domestic student. But you don't know what that's going to happen next year. I mean, conventional wisdom is you don't apply. HBS doesn't have this anymore in round 3. Because there's fewer seats left, and they're looking really to kind of fill up the holes in terms of making a very diverse class. But then COVID happened, and I would argue that in 2020 you had the better chance of applying in round 3 because a lot of international students weren't coming, and they were looking to kind of fill up those seats. So do it. I always say keep the noise at bay in terms of when do you think my best chances are, and all that, and focus on when the time is right to you. When do you feel like you have, I just talked to somebody the other day too, and I just said, do you feel like you can wait another year and that's okay? Or do you feel like I really have to do this now? And, listen to your gut and make those decisions according to that.
I think that's well put. And if we go back to the idea of a strategic career plan, I think sequencing is very important, and where you put your MBA relative to what you want to do in the future is also an important thing to consider, right? So if you've had a few experiences, a few years of work experience, and you want to transition into another industry, or maybe you want to take that pause, maybe it's the best time now instead of waiting for 10 years. And so let's just, so in the interest of time, I think we are running out of time, and we had a lot of questions that came in. So maybe we can go quickly through a few of them and then we'll wrap up. And please feel free if you have to run. The event is recorded, and so it will be available afterwards. I think one of the key questions that kept coming up is the relevance of the MBA versus other industry-specific certifications. So for example, in finance, you have the CFA. In supply chain, you have the CSER, and you also mentioned, Barbara, about the executive MBA. So could you sort of weigh in on the comparative advantages?
Oh, and yeah. So there's so many, and I work with people who apply not only to MBAs, but I've worked with people who apply to a master's, of supply chain management, master's of finance programs, master's, I don't remember all the names because there's so many different programs out there, business analytics, human-centered design. I can't even remember the names of some of the degrees because they're really niche ones or whatever. So I think the way I look at it is you're looking for breadth or depth. If you know you want to be the COO or oversee supply chain functions, and or the accounting side with the CPA, I think that will give you the depth for that. But if you're looking for leadership skills, or you're looking for versatility, if you're like, you know what, I think I might do this, but then I want to do that, or I'm open to changing that, then I think of the MBA as the most versatile degree, and I really do think it is the best degree for strengthening your leadership skills. And again, the world keeps changing. There's a lot of, to use your words, Ruth, ambiguity. How do you manage in a kind of uncertain environment where things can just happen at the drop of a hat, and all of that. And I think the MBA can really, and it's a people skills too, more than you get more of the technical skills, and certainly with some of the other courses that you can do. But I'm a big proponent of advanced education, so I'm not going to say no to anything. Anything you can learn from, take a Coursera class, or do HBS's core class, which a lot of people do before applying for the MBA program. Any of that is going to just definitely help you and give you more, more tools in your toolkit, and to basically become a stronger candidate for other jobs that you apply to, or other opportunities. But I am such a believer in the MBA, and the thing, I'll just tell you a little quick side story too. I did marketing. I worked for did some marketing work for programs that weren't MBA programs. And one was at a school in the US, a university in the US, was a master's of audio technology. And I was trying to learn from the students, why people were doing this and the values. But in my head, I kept saying, but why are you doing an MBA? The MBA is the degree. So I'm just really bullish, and I'm really a huge fan of just not only the career, but the personal and just the life-changing benefits of it. And to Tristan's point, the relationships that are formed. Just meet some really awesome people.
Okay, yeah. I was going to ask Triston if he has pursued any other qualifications or certifications apart from the MBA.
Yeah, so the only other certification is one that I'm actually going through right now, which is through the Institute of Executive Coaching and Leadership, which is one of the organizations under the International Coaching Federation umbrella. And that's just training and certification to become a coach, which is part of my role internally at C, which is the Singaporean tech company that I'm currently working at. And a big part of what I ultimately want to do, which is at an individual level, how do you help people reach their full potential? And that's where the coaching element is. And then at an organizational level, how do you help organizations craft and design their culture in a way where their employees are going to be engaged? So that's a certification that I'm currently going through. near term, I don't anticipate taking on additional certifications beyond the coaching one. Long term, I still haven't ruled off getting a PhD, especially if I wanted to do academia, although it's not the research side of it that I'm particularly interested, but more so a little bit of additional coursework, potentially around psychology or adult learning or one of those areas as well. So I haven't ruled off additional degrees, but at the moment, I think the combination of the degrees that I have now, plus the coaching certification, feels like a good mix in terms of what I'm looking to do professionally.
So the learning never stops.
Of course.
Okay, yeah. So I think we should wrap up at this point. I think I'll just answer quickly one of the questions that came in about regional MBAs. So because a lot of participants were from the Africa region, I think some of the universities in Africa that offer great MBAs include the Graduate School of Business at UCT. That's the University of Cape Town. There's also the African Leadership University School of Business, as well as, you know, the American University in Cairo Business School, Lagos Business School, Strathmore Business School. They also have great MBA programs. And so because of the time, we'll stop here. We'll wrap up the discussion. I have submitted a few resources to the audience that you can look through. So this includes the website for both Triston and Barbara, as well as a great podcast that I've been listening to lately, and that actually informed the essence of this webinar. So thinking about your career and how to strategically plan for it. Reid Hoffman talks extensively about it. I have read the book. It's also as insightful, Startup Review, which he writes alongside Ben Casnocha. And so that's something that I would recommend to other young professionals who are really thinking about this idea of planning for their career and what assets will add value and keep bringing on dividends in the long term, right? And so one of them, of course, which we've discussed today is the MBA. So closing remarks from our two speakers, and then that will be it for today. So Triston, I'll let you go first, and then Barbara, closing remarks.
Yeah, I would say closing remarks. I'd certainly want to echo one of the things that Barbara shared, which is around don't let things like the GMAT or the price tag get in the way of applying. So if this is something that you're interested in, then I would encourage you to pursue it with a lot of intentionality. By that, I mean, be very clear on what you want to get out of the MBA program, because I actually think that while if I think of the components of the MBA application process, the GMAT for me was painful because I didn't really see there a lot of like ROI, and that I didn't get benefit from studying these mathematical equations and preparing for the GMAT. But the actual essay portion of the application, which many people describe as really cumbersome and so forth, but I would, encourage people to look at that a little bit differently, put a positive spin on it, because by answering this question and really investing the time and energy to answer this question, these are questions that you should be answering anyway around what you want to do with your career and your life. And so it's really a good excuse to do it, and a good excuse to to leverage reaching out to peers, family, having them review your essays and so forth. So with that, I would really, encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in doing, pursue it with intentionality, be very thoughtful about the application process, look at the application process as an opportunity in and of itself for you to grow and drive your introspection and so forth. And then lastly, if people do have questions, please feel free to follow up with me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I'm very responsive there. So I will either, I will get back to you or point you in the right direction if it's something that I don't have an answer to. So please do feel free to reach out. And with that, it's been a real pleasure, Ruth and Barbara. Thank you both so much.
Okay, Barbara, any closing remarks?
Yeah, again, just to echo what Triston said, thank you for this opportunity. I could talk about MBAs all day, and sometimes I think I do, but I really appreciate the opportunity. I've been doing this for a long time, and I definitely see the value. And just in terms of the deterrence, the other deterrent that I see is when I talk to people and people reach out to me on LinkedIn. So please, connect with me there and follow me. I put a lot of content on LinkedIn related to MBAs and helpful stories of students and what they're doing, and kind of interesting things about their journeys and all that. But don't let the odds deter you as well. It is and I think that has come across where people come and say, hey, I talked to somebody and they're like, yeah, we don't think you should apply to so which school because you don't have any chance of getting in. And I'm like, how can somebody say that? Because like, we're not the admissions committee and you can't read minds and all of that. And somebody at HBS and the admissions team once said, the chances of getting in and you don't apply are 0. And then another person and I keep mentioning those 2 schools because those are the ones that keep coming up. But, again, I work students applying to all a broad variety. But Stanford said, hey, you could either weed yourself out or you could let us filter you out. Like, which one do you want to do? Like, maybe let us, have the opportunity rather than you self-selecting not even to do it. So don't be intimidated by that. By the same token, it's kudos to Triston to getting into HBS. It's not easy to get in. Not everyone does. And there's a lot of competition for the seats. But I say that everyone has some value, and don't kind of think like I don't have this star-studded background or I haven't done, something amazing and all of that. Everyone, you have an experience that other people can learn from, a perspective that's worth sharing. So, don't let that hold you back.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara. And that wraps up today's discussion. Thank you to our very inspiring panelists for their invaluable insights, and more importantly, to you, our audience, for joining us today. The main takeaway for me, I believe, is that in many ways, an MBA can singularly supercharge your career, but only if you're intentional and strategic about it, how it fits into the bigger picture of your life, and also having a cautiously optimistic and sober mindset, right? So we've had some great conversations and thought-provoking questions coming in from our audience. So thank you for that. Indeed, if it wasn't for the time constraint, we would have explored more questions further. And so I hope this was useful as you map out your strategic career plan, and hopefully we can have more of these discussions in future. Thank you everyone for joining in.